Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for us to begin part 2. Do you know they've done communication studies? For many years I was a communications professor, and that it takes about 5 to 7 minutes to move around and all that, and then come back and your attention span starts over, right? So that's why between you go to Bible class and you have a break, you come to worship, it's no big deal. Your attention span starts over. So no reason now for your mind to wander because your attention span is back to square one. So thank you for taking your break. I also wanted to, before we get into our new material, I neglected to read a little something that I think really kind of summarizes what part 1 was all about. This one counselor says this: after listening to couples pour out their marital frustrations and disappointments, I'm convinced that the lack of covenant commitment lies at the heart of most fractured marriages. To put it frankly, most couples have made contracts instead of covenants. What's the difference? A contract involves demands and expectations and bargaining and negotiation. A contract is a 50-50 proposition. Marriage does not work very well as a contract. In fact, the modern day contractual approach to marriage has failed miserably. There's one divorce in the United States every 36 seconds. 2,400 a day, 16,800 a week, and 876,000 divorces in a typical year. Can we look for something maybe better than what we have? James Q. Wilson of the University of California, Los Angeles observes, marriage, once a sacrament, has become in the eyes of the law a contract that is easily negotiated, renegotiated, or rescinded. Within a few years, no-fault divorce on demand became possible after a millennial in which such an idea would have been unthinkable. It is now easier to renounce a marriage than a mortgage. In contrast, a covenant marriage, on the other hand, is one based on unconditional love, the willingness to sacrifice your needs for those of your spouse, and a steadfast commitment, regardless of what it costs, to keep that commitment. Marriage is not a 50-50 arrangement. It's a 100% giving of yourself to your partner. And when you do, you will find yourself in the joyful pursuit of trying to outgive each other. And you'll end up getting more than you could have ever imagined possible. Isn't that well said? So, let's get to part 2 now. When I was analyzing this, and I thought, why is it that so many people are breaking their vows and acting like it's just no big deal? And I began to realize it isn't just a problem with people divorcing and going against their vows. It's a problem in general in our culture that people don't take their word seriously. So there's sort of a generic problem, and then there's a specific application, which is influencing families. Our society in general has undervalued the keeping of our word. I don't really have to defend that. That's so true all around us. It's become ubiquitous. And one of the things that I think we Christians can do to let our light shine is to be people that take our vows and our commitments seriously in all areas. Because people don't understand that by our words we will be saved, or by our words we will be condemned. And so when I grew up, my dad used to always say, make promises sparingly and keep them faithfully. And that is such a good practice. Obviously, the scriptures value it highly. One of my favorite verses along this line is Ecclesiastes 5. It says, do not be rash with your mouth. Let not your heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven and you are on the earth. Let your words be few. And when you make a vow to God, do not defer to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay that which you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Same thing is true with the Zion dweller, the people who one day will dwell in heaven and has the characteristics of the Zion dweller. And one of them in verse 4 is he or she who swears to his own hurt and changes not. And I know people get in unhappy marriages and they want out. But the Zion dweller remembers, I made this commitment and I have to figure out some way to make this work. Or I can't really glorify God. I've got to figure out some way to keep my word and be faithful. That's the kind of person that has the character to work through things rather than to just so quickly bail and move on to someone else. It's really interesting to me that most of the time people don't bail on love and they don't bail on marriage. They bail on the person that they're supposed to love. Isn't that sad? Don't bail on the person that you committed to love and that committed to love you. Don't give up on each other so easily. The Bible says in Numbers 30 and verse 2 that when we make a vow to the Lord or take an oath, we must not break our word, but must do everything that we said. Old and New Testament, yet your yea be yea and your nay be nay. So part of this is just in general helping people to be more serious about keeping their word, period. A marriage is only as strong as the commitments which serve as its infrastructure. I love this statement about commitment. I shared this with my family and my girls when they were young. Commitment is what transforms a promise into reality. It's the words that speak boldly of our intentions. It is the actions that speak louder than words. It is making the time when there is none. It is coming through time after time, year after year. Commitment is the stuff character is made of, the power to change the face of things. It is the daily triumph of integrity over skepticism. And that's the kind of solid commitment that really successful couples talk about having and taking seriously. So why is it that couples often say, oftentimes pretty heavy-duty vows, and still their marriages fail? I mean, I've lost count of the couples that I've tied the knot with that eventually lost their faith, lost their spouse, and sadly, I fear, lost their souls. It wasn't a problem with watered-down vows, but yet it still happens. What's the problem? Well, I think in some cases, people treat the vows superficially. And I've one of the ways I counsel is I remind them about this as a spiritual relationship, a spiritual covenant. And then we have a prayer together, and I say, now let's go back to the beginning. What do you remember you vowed to each other? And I'm amazed how many people look at me with a blank face and say, I don't remember much at all about our vows we said to one another. The preacher who married us just kind of came up with some vows and asked me at the right time to say, I do, and I did. I'll never forget one guy who said, something about, regardless of how bad it gets, I have to stick it out unless she's unfaithful to me. I said, is that all that you remember about your vows on that wonderful wedding day? That day of celebration? That's all you can say? That's all you remember? The guy goes, yeah. Another guy told me, he said, well, no need talking about that. That's ancient history. I said, the problem is, it's not ancient history to God. And one of the reasons your marriage is in trouble is because you view it as ancient history. You made those solemn vows that day, and it doesn't look like you've given them much thought since then. Sadly, many people stand at the altar, and basically, the guy especially tends to think this. Instead of saying, I do, he says to himself, I'm done. I got my woman. Now I can kind of, I've got a wife, and now I can go and pursue my career and other things that I want to pursue. No. You're not done. You're just beginning. And that's what those vows are supposed to be all about. And too often, they aren't even thought about in advance. There's not enough forethought. I spend a lot of time with the couples that I work with. I will not marry someone unless I can do premarital counseling with them. And I talk to them about their vows and their importance. and I have them write their own. I kind of tutelage them along. But it needs to be personal. It needs to be something you've thought about. It needs to be in your own words. These are going to be the marching orders for the rest of your married life. Give them proper emphasis, for heaven's sakes. And the whole point of the wedding is so the witnesses to come can come and witness the exchanging of the vows, and that's the one thing you don't remember anything about. No wonder so many marriages are in trouble. And you go to the typical, wedding album, and they got all these pictures and wonderful pictures of the beautiful bride and the groomsmen and the bridesmaids and how their colors match and how, everything looks so pretty. Where are the vows? That's what really matters. I'm not interested in just, having a wonderful wedding. I want to have a wonderful life that springs forth from that wedding. So I have them write their own vows, laminate them, and have that be the first part of their wedding album. So every time they open it up, that's what you see first. And then you frame it and put up on a wall as a constant reminder. And at least once a year on your wedding anniversary, you take it out and you go over your vows again. My wife and I have done that for the last 45 years. That is so important. And I think that's one of the reasons why oftentimes so many marriages fail. They're often uttered once and then forgotten, and they're of little use in a time of crisis because people don't reflect upon them much, especially before they act or get in an argument or say something they shouldn't have said. What matters when it comes to your vows is your current level of commitment to each other, which ought to be growing over time and not shrinking. It's so much more than just, I got to stick it out because I made those vows before God. That's not the spirit here. One woman was talking about how she had not cheated on her husband, and so she knew that, he hadn't cheated on her, so they had no grounds, so they just have to stick it out. And I said, there are a lot more positive aspects to vows than that one that is more negative. Instead of just sticking it out unhappily, why don't you focus on serving and loving and cherishing your spouse? Those are the more important vows. And if you would do those things, you wouldn't have to worry about having to stick it out because you feel like you're not in a very good place. Don't forget, the most important part of your vows is what's active and daily, practical love demonstrated on a daily basis. What a difference it would make if people would really take these things seriously. I believe when it comes to our vows, we don't want to do dial-up. We want to do broadband. And we want to have these personalized vows, and we need a thorough and insightful understanding of 6 marital promises, and all basic vows ought to contain these 6 areas. First, in some way or another, you express, I'm going to love you as long as we both shall live. Obviously, this is a love covenant. I'm going to be kind to you. I'm going to sacrifice for you as needed. And I'm going to cherish and honor you. I'm going to be thoughtful to you. I'm going to esteem you. And I will be what a husband and wife owes to their spouse. In other words, I'm going to do what I can to meet your needs. More about that tomorrow in our workshop. Number 4, this is one of the most important that's often overlooked. I will take you as you are. And then typically in a wedding ceremony, they will mention the person's name. And you take the whole person's name. Gail Parcell. Gail Melinda Parcell was my wife's name. Do you take her, Gail Melinda Parcell? And I say yes. Do you take Carlton Brent Hunter? And she says yes. What does that mean? Let me illustrate it this way. When I was a kid, I used to love to get these 45 RPMs. I'm really showing you how old I am. But for those of you that have never seen one of those, they used to have these vinyl records, and you would go to the store and you would buy a hit single, and they were called 45s. And you'd buy it for the A side, they called it. And then on the back, they had a B side, which was usually a song that never made it, wasn't a hit. And you take it home, and sometimes you'd play the B side, and you'd think, no wonder that didn't make it a hit. So you just play the A side to your heart's content, forget about the B side. When people date, they put their best foot forward. You're kind of marketing yourself. Trust me, you fall in love with the other person's A side. But here's the catch. Everybody's got a B side. And when you take them home after the ceremony, the A side and the B side plays equally, whether you like it or not. I mean, all of us have little quirks and idiosyncrasies and annoying habits. We've all got things that are not quite ideal. Anybody out there snore? The point is, you have to accept the whole person. And nobody's perfect, including you, and she has to accept you, and vice versa. And so this idea of taking the other person, even with their weaknesses, or maybe with their illnesses, with their shortcomings that are not quite so desirable, that's a part of love. That's why we're saved by grace, and God takes us even though we are far from perfect. You need to count the cost and recognize some days are going to be tough. And some days your spouse is going to be throwing up with the flu. And do you lovingly show support, or do you just, this is not what I signed up for? Yes, it is what you signed up for. So, take the other person as they are. Everybody's got a B-side. And you say, well, forsake all others and cling to you only. I'm going to be faithful to you, especially in the area of my romantic interest and feelings. And here's the kicker. I will do all these things for better, for worse, in sickness and in health. I like those old traditional vows. It's a statement of being unconditional in your commitment to each other. Now, somebody goes, I don't like all that. That's a little much. You don't have to get married. But if you get married, that's what you need to be committed to. And I tell couples, if that scares you and you're not really ready for that, then you need to back off until you are ready. Count the cost. Probably heard of eHarmony, pretty famous kind of web-based dating site. Neil Clark is the guy who's the brain behind that. And he's a PhD in marriage and family. I've read a lot of his stuff. He's very good. Before eHarmony, he came out with a book called The Triumphant Marriage. 100 extremely successful couples reveal their secrets. You see, in sociology, you usually study dysfunction, study problems in society and problems in family, and then you come up with solutions to all this dysfunction. He said, why don't we just forget about that for a minute and look at families that are really happily married, families that don't have dysfunction. You see, when you look at married couples, there's a top tier of 17% of married couples where they both, after 10 years or more of marriage, report that their marriage is highly emotionally satisfactory. Not perfect, but boy, are they ever glad they got married. And if they had to do over again, they'd ask the same person again. Only 17% of marriages have that. To God's glory, every couple in this church ought to make sure they're in that top tier. Have a marriage that glorifies God. And this guy came up with some really good research, and he found that one of the things that these couples have that are very happily married and very successful is they've all had difficulties at times. They've all had rough things to go through. None of them had really idyllic lives where everything just seemed to go smoothly. Far from it. They all had issues, but they pulled together. And they worked through together because they were committed to each other and to the marriage and their family. And their vows played a big part of their success. I think this is an area that is really overlooked. And he says that the infrastructure for every marriage is the level of commitment that both party has toward each other. So I was reading through this. I mean, this is probably 25 years ago. I've lost track, a long time ago. But I thought, now what can I do to make my vows be more a part of me? Well, Dr. Warren suggests that you rewrite your vows to update them based on what you've learned and hopefully your maturity over the years. And you make it kind of like your favorite series of Bible verses that you've memorized. You lay it up in your heart. And then he says that you go ahead and repeat it to each other about 2 times a week for the first 10 years of marriage and 1 time a week for the rest of the marriage. And I remember showing this to Gail and said, what do you think about this? This kind of sounds extreme. Remember, I'm the guy who takes the wedding vows out once a year and, puts them on the wall and to the front of the wedding album. And I said, what do you think about this? And Gail and I both initially said, man, this guy's really extreme. And so I initially kind of rejected this. I couldn't imagine me with a straight face telling couples this is what they ought to do. And then I remembered the Lord's Supper. Here's the famous picture by Leonardo da Vinci of the Last Supper. Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. If I understand the Bible correctly, how often does God, in our most important spiritual covenant, want us to refresh and remind ourselves of our relationship with Jesus and what he's done for us? How many times are we supposed to partake of the Lord's Supper, the covenant meal? At least once a week, right? Well, if that's true for the Lord's Supper and my relationship with Christ, maybe that wouldn't be so bad when it comes to my marriage. So Gail and I reconsidered, and I said, I'll start. So I spent a lot of time on this, and these are the vows that I came up with that I was able to memorize and start saying frequently to Gail. I promise I will do everything in my power to help you get to heaven. Now, the reason I said that is because when I proposed to Gail, she initially kind of put me off. We had been broken up for a while, and she felt like she needed more time, and I was like so discouraged. And so I had to ask her 3 times before I got a yes. And so after I finally got a yes, I said, what made you change your mind? She said, well, I've been praying about it. And I think the 2 of us together have a lot better chance of getting to heaven together than apart. To be real honest, at 24, I kind of wanted a more romantic answer. But at any rate, over the years, that has meant a whole lot to both of us. And it's true. And so that's where I thought my vows ought to start. I promise to do everything in my power to help you get to heaven, to accept and to remain loyal to you always. I promise to put you and our marriage second only to God and be open and honest with you always as we strive for oneness. I promise to cherish, honor, and support you in good times and bad, and strive to love you selflessly like Christ loved the church as I meet your deepest needs. And I promise to pilot, provide, and protect you and our family, and to do these things unconditionally until death do us part, so help me God. It's not that long. You can memorize that. So I asked my wife, I said, what do you think about this? She goes, I really like this. I said, okay, it's your turn. And so she thought about it, and she said, well, I like all of this except the pilot, provide, and protect part. That's your job. So she took that out and put in her vows, a section that has to do with her role as a godly woman. I promise to admire, honor, and obey you in good times and bad, and strive to be an excellent keeper at home and be sensitive to your deepest needs. Promise to love you and do all these things unconditionally until death do us part, so help me God. I never get tired of hearing my wife tell me that. And I can't tell you how much this has meant to our marriage. Sometimes when we've had a difficulty or an argument or a disagreement of some sort, before I take it any further, I say, let me go downstairs. I want to pray about this first. This argument's getting a little heated. Or I'll go out for a walk and I'll play these vows that I've laid up in my heart in my head. And it reminds me of my role and what I'm supposed to do, and it helps me not to say anything that I might regret. It just sort of centers me and calms me. It is really valuable to have your vows on the front burner, folks, not somewhere way back in the cobwebs. Back in 2010, we were in Oldham Woods, Kentucky, working with the church there. And Gail had a flare-up of her ulcerative colitis. And the nurse practitioner there said that she was like 48 hours away from dying. I mean, she was terribly dehydrated and was just in awful shape. She felt terrible. I was terrified at that news. So I remember being there in the hospital room with her, and she was too weak to hardly speak. But I was there with her, kind of holding her hand, praying with her. And all of a sudden, I heard her say something kind of underneath her breath, and I couldn't tell what she was saying. I said, "Honey, I can't hear you." And I finally got down real close, and she was whispering to me, "Say your vows to me. Say your vows to me." And so I was able to say the vows to her. And she started crying, and she said, "You really do that? Thank you. That is so comforting to me at a time like this." It's kind of a part of your connection as a couple and a reminder of your spiritual covenant. And I was so glad I could comfort her with those words. I have never heard of a couple going through this exercise of rewriting their vows that hasn't told me later, "This was great." I've had couples come to me that says, "We blew it off and didn't do it. And then later on when we did it, we wish we'd done it sooner." I've had that. But I want you to understand the value of what Dr. Warren is saying. You have to rehearse it until it's part of you. Verbalized regularly over a long period of time, it takes on tremendous power. So that's the homework. That's the transformation. Is go home and do this. Do your homework. I have a sheet that I've given you, steps to reconstruct and refresh your vows. Let's take a moment and turn to that. I hope you have your notebook with you. Turn to page 7. This is the transformational homework I mentioned. This is what I suggest. Number 1, what do you remember most about your wedding vows from memory? Quickly brainstorm together on a separate sheet of paper and see what you can piece together. Number 2, what vows have you heard said by others that you liked? Reflect upon what you have come to understand is vitally important to you when you're married since your wedding day that could be added to a new updated set of vows you decide to commit to each other. Brainstorm together. Make this fun. Ask your mate for ideas as to what is important to him or to her. And I better not hear we're going to stay together until, as long as the jokes don't get stale. Anyway, number 3, look over the 6 parts listed on the previous handout of the traditional marriage vows, to make them broadband and not dial up. Use this as a guide to help you reconstruct your vows. Can you put them in your own words that will have special meaning to you? Given the different roles that God gives the man and wife, look over the handout, the most important words about husband and wife. That's 8, 9, and 10 of your handouts that I've given you. Select certain scriptures that jump out at you and take things directly from the Holy Spirit and consider putting that in your vows. Condense all of this into a brief list that you can both memorize and say to each other on a regular basis. Periodic rewrites of the commitment will make it stronger and more meaningful. Now, I want to ask those of you that are here and married, how many of you are willing to follow this homework and rewrite your vows in the next, 3-4 weeks? There's my favorite redhead right there with her hand up. Come on, let me see your hands. Paul Sheehan, thank you. Those of you that didn't raise your hand, you're missing out. I want you to rethink this and understand its value. And I want to conclude with this. Here are a couple suggestions. Take your time, but make a commitment to go through the worksheet. Write it out and read it to each other first until you've memorized it. A lot of the Bible verses I memorized are not things that I sat down specifically to memorize, but I've just quoted them so often I now know them by heart. And so if you read this to each other off this card, eventually you won't need the card. So don't let that be a burden to you. And share with others once complete. You guys have small groups here. I think it would be neat if all the married couples in the small group shared their vows with each other. And sometimes I get, well, I'm a private person. This is too personal. This is just between me and my spouse. I got a question for you. When are wedding vows usually said? In a wedding in front of hundreds of people. What do you mean you're a private person? I'm not supposed to be ashamed of my Lord, and so I'm willing to confess him before others and not be ashamed of him. I'm not ashamed of my dear wife, and I don't mind shouting from the rooftops about my love for her, and vice versa. Vows are supposed to be, by definition, a public thing. So don't talk to yourself like that. It's something you ought to feel good about completing and sharing, and do so with a sense of appreciation and even pride. And I want to also suggest, when my wife and I first did this, our kids were still at home. And we would periodically say these vows as a part of our family dinner. And our kids would kind of go, "What are you doing?" And I'd say, "I love your mother. Our marriage is important to us. Part of our job as a parent is to model before you a godly marriage, because we want you to have a good marriage one day. And so I want you to listen to these words. We really mean them. And I want them to give you security that mom and dad are going to be together until death do us part." And so we didn't do it very often, but sometimes we did it in front of the kids. And I think that was good for them. And I think it'd be good for your family as well. So that's how you can have a spiritual covenant that is fresh and real and vibrant. And I always think it's neat that after you exchange your vows in a wedding, we're always told you may now kiss your bride, right? And you seal it with a kiss. I know I looked a whole lot better 45 years ago. Gail looks about the same. That's not even fair. But think of Song of Solomon, chapter 8. "Set me as a seal upon your heart. The fire of love stops at nothing. It sweeps everything before it. Flood waters can't drown love. Torrents of rain can't pull it out. Love can't be bought. Love can't be sold. It's not to be found in the marketplace." You know, the Beatles sang, "Money can't buy me love." That's true. You can have a real successful career. You can make a lot of money. But if you are lonely and you have no one to share all that money with, and if you're not really close to people, you don't have any intimacy in your life, it's a pretty miserable existence. Listen, no amount of personal, professional success will ever make up for failure in the home. And to have a really vibrant marriage, you've got to put time and attention into it. And it starts with your vows. Because marriage is a spiritual covenant. Okay. Before we have our closing prayer tonight, and I assume you're going to get up with some closing announcements, Brent? No? Just a prayer? Okay. Any thoughts or feedback before we close? Our redhead there in the back. She showed me her ring. Let me see. Forgotten her name. Cindy and Bob, right? Okay, Cindy. She goes, "Look at my ring." Can you explain to the class about that ring that you have? Has everybody seen Cindy's ring? It's a love triangle that's supposed to represent God at the top and Cindy and Bob at the bottom. And she's got some other things that are symbolic of their covenant, and they got a, what you say, 30th wedding anniversary?
Yeah, the wedding set is 31 years old, but he gave me the triangle diamond on our 30th wedding anniversary, and each
Amen. Yeah.
And when it's on my hand, God is closest to my heart.
Yeah, I love that. And it's a token of the covenant. Bob, you're my hero. That is really cool. And that is really being a good romantic husband. And a lot of us could learn from that. Good for you. Anybody else have any other quick thoughts before we close? Remember, the transformation comes where? Not in the hearing, but in the doing. And I hope you'll take seriously. I hope the elders here will remind the married couples about the value of rewriting their vows and laying it up in their heart and following this the way that I've suggested. You know, you can have a very long, successful marriage. You can have successful kids. You can have a good life. You can make a lot of money. You can have a good retirement. And when you're old, you can have loving children all around you, and it looked like a picture from Norman Rockwell. But you still failed if you haven't understood that it's a spiritual covenant meant to glorify God, and you need to be a light in darkness, and that we're to be busy about serving others, not ourselves. So don't get all wrapped up in the American dream. Some of it is not at all where we ought to put our focus, and the things that are ultimately going to lead to heaven. So let's think about what we can do to restore and to recapture the divine design for the spiritual covenant of marriage. And you'll receive such a blessing if you do. Amen? All right. Let's close with a prayer, and I hope you'll be back for 9 o'clock when we're going to talk about some fun sort of marriage seminar stuff about the love bank and how to keep your passion and love alive, and things you can do to avoid hurting your spouse, and things you can do to make deposits in the love bank so at the end of each year you can be more deeply in love than you were in the prior year. And that's what we all want. And we're going to talk about some real practical ways to make that happen. And if you're thinking, I don't need that, I'm single, I'm not even married, or I'm a widow or a widower, this applies to all interpersonal relationships, not just to marriage. So this has value for somebody who just wants a better relationship with their roommate. This has value with somebody who wants to improve the relationship with their kids. It's really profound stuff. And I don't say that in any braggadocio way. I'm just repeating to you things that I have found have worked over 35 years of marriage counseling. And if you'll apply this, you can use it to help yourself, and if needed, help others, as we all are equipped for the ministry. Okay? All right, let's bow our heads. Our dear God, we're thankful for every person here tonight, and we're thankful for your wonderful word and the spiritual covenant that you've given us in our relationship with your son Jesus, and the spiritual covenant of marriage. We vow to you tonight to be faithful to you unto death, and we ask your special blessings upon every marriage and family here. And may they focus on each other in a way that will glorify you and be personally beneficial to each of them, and be a wonderful witness to Christ of everyone around them. Pray all these things in the name of Christ. And all the church said together, amen.